First on BBC One, the 9 o'clock news with Peter Sissons.
Good evening. The NATO allies reacted with barely concealed anger today to the scale of the human tragedy unfolding on the borders of Kosovo. And they promised that NATO warplanes would now concentrate on hitting the Serb forces who'd been driving out the Kosovar Albanians. Tony Blair said the job would be finished. The Americans promised a continuous and systematic aerial assault until President Milosevic could no longer impose his will. Tonight, the BBC's correspondents in the Balkans report on the refugee crisis and NATO's ongoing military campaign. Ben Brown in Skopje in Macedonia, where thousands of refugees are pouring through the border from Kosovo. George Alagaya in Kukes in Albania on the refugees' accounts of Serb atrocities. And John Simpson on the latest from the Serbian capital, Belgrade. First, Ben Brown in Macedonia.
They were forced to walk out of Kosovo along a railway track with landmines either side of it. These refugees had been trying to escape on a train, but Serb police refused to let it cross the border. They confiscated the passports and identity papers of many of these people and then told them to leave their homeland by foot. It looked like a scene from the Second World War, but this is 1999, and these are people who can scarcely believe the fate that has befallen them. Amina Fatisha is a woman almost as old as our century, a century which had hoped it would never witness such an exodus again. Amina is seriously ill, her heart and lungs are failing. Her family say it is a miracle she has survived the journey so far. It is difficult indeed to believe that this is modern Europe on the verge of the new millennium. These men, women and children have abandoned everything they ever had. They are walking along this railway track, the only way they can escape from Kosovo and escape from the Serbs. Each individual face tells its own story of trauma and of despair. These are men and women who say they've seen their homes burned down and who claim to have watched innocent civilians rounded up and taken away.
In one morning, they came, the masked people, and took one of my neighbors. We don't know where is he. Maybe he's killed, maybe he's massacred. We don't know nothing. I am alone here. I have nobody here. My brothers, my parents are out there. I don't know where they are.
I just wanted to say, just if somebody can hear me, just if somebody can help us, our people. I don't know what to say else. I left there my family.
Once the refugees had finally reached the safety of Macedonia, they at last dared to leave the railway line, streaming into a field that for a while would become their new home. A handful of aid workers gave out some food. There wasn't much of it at first, and the hungry scrambled for whatever scraps they could get. Some hadn't eaten properly for days. They almost trampled on a mother trying to breastfeed her baby. Relief workers struggled to cope, urging patience and promising that more food was on its way. The Macedonian police tried to hold back the surging mass of refugees, but thousands have come into this country already, and hundreds of thousands more may be on their way. Albanians at this official border crossing have queued for days to get out of Kosovo. So for many, escape by foot is the only option, even if it's across rough terrain, even if it risks interception by border guards. Their first thoughts now are to find some place, any place, that's safer than Kosovo. Already, though, their dreams are of returning to their homeland. Yet some know that may be a day they never live to see. Ben Brown, BBC News, on the Kosovo-Macedonia border.
In Kukes on the Kosovo-Albanian border, up to 3,000 people have been crossing the frontier every hour. All tell harrowing stories of fleeing their homes in the face of Serb attacks. George Alagaya is there.
Under the symbols of their nationalism, the Serbian authorities pushed the Albanian population of Kosovo into exile. By now, the refugees have been stripped of any document that says who they are. Only their despair is left as a mark of common identity.
This is no haphazard flow of people. There is a grim logic to what's going on. When you check where these refugees are coming from, you can see that Kosovo is being cleansed, ethnically cleansed, village by village, hour after hour.
The authorities here do their best to monitor where the refugees come from. Their list reveals an expulsion of industrial efficiency.
Can you show me on the map?
Starting with the outlying regions of Kosovo, Serb forces have moved remorselessly towards the interior, pushing towards the capital, Pristina. And as if to prove the point, this afternoon we saw the first refugees from Pristina, over 100 kilometers away. This man spoke of how he was beaten up. He wouldn't say exactly what happened to his wife, and I hadn't the heart to ask. About half the 100,000 refugees who've come across so far are being taken in by local families across Albania, a taste of the kinship they have been robbed of back home. After what's happened this past week, it's not difficult to work out what it would take to persuade these refugees back to Kosovo.
Only to have a very large international presence there, probably an armed presence, because I think they may have lost faith, or they've lost their confidence in having an observer mission.
Difficult as it is to accept, these people may be the more fortunate ones. Imagine what may be happening to those still left inside Kosovo. George Alagaya, BBC News, on the Kosovo-Albania border.
Well, our correspondent Ben Brown joins me now from the Macedonian capital, Skopje. Ben, are the aid agencies up to the scale of this tragedy?
Well, they are struggling to cope at the moment, Peter, but they do say they have large stockpiles of food here in Macedonia at least, and many relief workers too. But I have to say, when I've seen these refugees come across, especially at unauthorized crossing points where perhaps they're not initially expected, then there aren't many aid workers to help them. There isn't much food to give them immediately. But Britain, among other countries, say they're sending emergency relief flights here with emergency supplies, tents, blankets, and extra food and so on.
Are you convinced that what we are seeing here is the result of Serb policy, not just terrified people fleeing a war zone, as the Serbs would have us believe?
It does look like a pattern is emerging, that what the Serbs are trying to do, especially with the menfolk, is to take away their travel documents, to take away their passports, their identity papers, to make it very difficult for them ever to return to Yugoslavia, to return to Kosovo. And what the Serbs fear, I think in particular, is that men, if they do return, would join the Kosovo Liberation Army, the rebel force, and the Serbs really want, it seems, to tip all the men especially out of Kosovo.
Then what thoughts go through a reporter's mind seeing these sights in the dying months of the 20th century?
Terrible thoughts today for me. I've seen refugees many times in places like Africa, crying, sobbing, shattered lives. But when you see it in Central Europe at the end of the 20th century, it's almost beggars belief, and it is very hard to come to terms with.
Ben Brown, thank you. The escalation in the NATO campaign will mean that more than 400 aircraft taking part in the operation could now be flying around the clock. NATO officials say its pilots will be hitting a wider range of targets all over Yugoslavia, and those targets could include government and military buildings in the center of Belgrade. NATO claimed today that Yugoslav air power was now almost non-existent.
No let-up for NATO pilots and no sanctuary, say officials for Serb forces. Weather permitting, the air campaign is now 24 hours a day and will target Serb tanks and troops throughout Yugoslavia. What's more, as NATO's Secretary-General told the BBC, patience is fast running out with President Milosevic.
At the end of the day, the refugees which are leaving now the country will return. We guarantee those returns of these people who are suffering now so much. and that we will stop the criminal acts of Milosevic now, and that Milosevic probably will have to be in a different place after all this massacre is over.
Among the latest NATO claims of Serb atrocities, detailed in maps and aerial photos, the deliberate shelling of refugees trapped inside Kosovo, and chilling new reports of a systematic campaign to wipe out all memory of the Albanians expelled by eliminating documents.
Birth certificates, financial and other records, public records, are being systematically destroyed. This is a kind of Orwellian scenario.
A further sign of Western resolve today, the disclosure in The Hague by the Yugoslav war crimes prosecutor that this man, the notorious Serb paramilitary leader known as Arkan, is now wanted for war crimes. Not that in Belgrade this week he seemed much perturbed by it.
I don't give a damn if I'm the most wanted or if I'm the least wanted. I'm a Serbian patriot.
For the Russian parliament, though, NATO's upping of the tempo is a cause for fury. When they finished punching each other today, deputies called for extra funds for Russia's own military machine. And ships from Russia's Black Sea fleet are being readied to be sent to the conflict zone, a move Washington has already said it finds worrying. According to the Foreign Office, the outlook for any diplomacy over Kosovo at the moment is pretty bleak. Yesterday's failed Russian mission to Belgrade just reconfirmed the opinion that President Milosevic has no intention of negotiating. The only option NATO is relying on, it seems, is to break him militarily. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, at the Foreign Office in London.
In Belgrade, there's been no response from President Milosevic to NATO's rejection of his ceasefire proposals, but Moscow is reported to be preparing to hold more talks with the Serb government in an effort to end the airstrikes. Our correspondent in Belgrade, John Simpson, who's not able to report freely, has visited a hospital in the city. His report has been examined by the Serbian censors.
In this noticeably post-communist society, each highly controlled television news bulletin automatically starts with the latest doings of President Milosevic. Today he met his senior officials and presumably tried to work out what they should do now that NATO has turned down his peace feelers as inadequate. No sign has yet emerged, but it must be clear to him now that NATO is not going to give way. The bombing and rocketing will intensify until he does. The question here is, will NATO bomb the big military and police headquarters in the center of Belgrade? Just 50 yards or so down the road from the Ministry of Defense, now entirely empty, is the biggest hospital in Yugoslavia. The doctors are extremely nervous that if and when NATO hits the ministry, the hospital will suffer, and so will the patients. They're getting the beds ready for the casualties they fully expect. There are some here already. This man was injured by a cruise missile which hit the outskirts of the city. The hospital takes only the most serious cases. Even so, the number of casualties here after a week of bombing seems low. The deputy mayor of Belgrade said yesterday that 6 people had been killed in the city. A general at the military hospital today said 8. Still, what worries the doctors here is the shortage of key drugs, painkillers, anesthetics, insulin.
Tonight, so far, there's been no bombing here, but it's presumably going to come, and it could be tough. The interesting thing is that the Serbs are very little concerned with trying to promote their side of things to opinion abroad. It wasn't easy, for instance, for us to get permission to go to the hospital today. They feel the outside world is largely against them, so they don't care very much about it. John Simpson, BBC News, Belgrade.
And later in this news, we'll be assessing the impact of the NATO bombing campaign 1 week after it began. But first, the rest of the day's news. Tony Blair and his Irish counterpart Bertie Ahern are back at Hillsborough Castle in Belfast this evening, where talks between the parties in the Northern Ireland peace process are continuing. Both men have been upbeat about progress, but the Ulster Unionists were more pessimistic, stressing that the IRA's Easter statement made no mention of the central issue for Unionists: what happens to the IRA's guns?
Back for more. Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern have both had Prime Minister's questions in their respective parliaments, but returned to Hillsborough, making a point of arriving together. This was a determined show of unity. They believe a breakthrough is within reach. They spoke earlier. Both were distinctly upbeat.
We believe there has been good progress made here, but there is still more to do. We have instructed our ministers and our officials to carry on working throughout the day in order to try and get that progress firmed up and all the things done that need to be done in order to deliver this agreement in full.
We're probably down to 1 point, and that difference is about timing and dates, and that is it. I think the principles are established.
The Prime Minister's message: the basic plan is in place. Their challenge to Gerry Adams and David Trimble: find a way of getting it to work. The problem? How to coincide the forming of the devolved Assembly's executive or cabinet with whatever move the IRA makes on the decommissioning of its weaponry. Sinn Féin's chief complaint is that the Ulster Unionists are using the weapons issue spuriously to prevent them entering government.
The fact that they're insisting that this is a precondition flies in the face of what they agreed last year. It is bad faith, and I think it's on the responsibility of the two governments and the other parties to point that out, as well as Sinn Féin.
Many of the Ulster Unionist Assembly members are now at Hillsborough, and this other principal party to the central dispute was not in the optimistic camp.
We are hampered at this stage because there is not even as yet any sign that the Republican movement will commit itself to implementing its share of the agreement.
Once again, the lights are burning late at Hillsborough. The Prime Ministers really don't want to let this one go. The talks could run all night. As loyalists protest outside, the key to the negotiations inside is to make any IRA decommissioning voluntary and not at the command of unionists. And unionists may have to accept that the timing and nature of any arms gesture may be less than they want. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Hillsborough Castle.
A deal has been reached between the government and BMW to secure the future of the Rover car plant at Longbridge in Birmingham. Under the agreement, BMW, which owns Rover, will receive up to £200 million in government aid.
It was sunny in Longbridge today. About 40,000 families depend on the factory. As workers left this evening, they breathed sighs of relief.
Morale in there has just gone up 100%. Everybody's really happy. Everyone's put the money in today, so we can all smile today.
Brilliant. It's about time all the missing amounts to be stopped and that they're going to sort them out for us. Brilliant.
The axe has hung over Britain's biggest factory for 2 months. BMW undecided on whether to redevelop the site, spending £1.7 billion, or close it down. Yesterday, the head of BMW told the government the longer it took agreeing a grant, the more chance of Longbridge closing. Today, the government came up with the money.
I'm delighted that we've got a done deal so that the workers of Longbridge and the economy of the West Midlands, and indeed the country generally, will benefit from the agreement we've reached today.
New Rover models have been launched this year, but Rover sales are plummeting. Unions hope today's deal will reverse the fall.
But it will now allow customers to go out and buy Rover cars and have a degree of confidence, knowing that the company is here and indeed is here to stay.
If he's wrong, the real problems start. If Rover fails, it will take BMW down with it. Putting money into Longbridge is a high-stake, calculated gamble. Stephen Evans, BBC News.
A police officer is to be charged with murder after an unarmed man was shot dead during a raid. PC Chris Sherwood will be charged with killing James Ashley during the raid on his home in St Leonards, East Sussex, last January. 4 other officers from the Sussex force involved in the raid are to be charged with neglect of duty. On May the 6th, voters will make history by electing the first members of the new Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly. The contest marks the biggest change in the British Constitution for centuries. Our political editor Robin Oakley has been given exclusive access to the newly completed chamber in Edinburgh, where the 129 members of the Scottish Parliament will hold their debates. From there, he reports on the battleground as devolution becomes a reality.
Technology meets tradition in the Assembly Hall on the Mound in Edinburgh. Some of the Parliament's members will have been elected the traditional way. Others will be top-ups chosen off a party list to make things more proportional. So with single-party dominance unlikely, they'll sit around a horseshoe, not facing across a divide. Their powers will be considerable. The Scottish Parliament will be able to vary income tax up or down by up to 3p in the pound. It will have power to make laws on health, education, agriculture and transport. Westminster, though, will keep control of foreign policy, constitutional change, the UK's economic system and social security rates. Memorials like the Wallace Monument, the imposing tribute to Scotland's most famous freedom fighter, help fuel the fires of nationalism. But will the Parliament help or hinder separatists? The Scottish National Party believe it will lead on to independence.
If the Scottish Parliament works, it's going to be the focal point of Scots national life. People will identify with Edinburgh, they'll want more powers there. If it doesn't work, it will be because of the powers retained in London, so they will still want more power in Edinburgh. I mean, this isn't a single event, devolution, it's a process of change, a process of independence.
But Labour's chief architect of the new system insists he's delivered what the people desired, and that they don't want an expensive divorce from England.
People of Scotland have a choice between a party that wants simply to break away from Britain and imagines that will solve our problems, and a party that really wants to make this Parliament serve Scotland, to tackle the issues that matter, like education, health, jobs, and that is the Labour Party.
The first results come in of Britain's 1955 general election.
That year, the Tories took more than half Scotland's votes. At the last election, they didn't win a single Scottish seat. Hoping to start a comeback, they now accept the Parliament they long opposed.
Parliament is a reality, it's a permanent institution, it's for keeps, there's no going back. So those of us who believe in Scotland as part of the United Kingdom, those of us who are Scottish and British and proud to be both, have got to make the Parliament work in that context.
The Liberal Democrats are campaigning in the hope they'll emerge holding the balance of power, but they're pleased enough to be getting the Home Rule for which they've argued so long.
We want the people of Scotland to be able to take responsibility for our own affairs over a whole range of issues such as education, health, jobs, transport, the things that matter to people in their everyday life.
The battle for these seats will be intense. It will have a vital influence on the future shape of the UK. But no party is likely to emerge from the proportional voting system with an overall majority. So we'll see a new style of politics too, as the parties are forced to wheel and deal amongst themselves to form Scotland's government. Robin Oakley, BBC News, in the Scottish Parliament chamber in Edinburgh.
Football now, and Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have all been involved in qualifying matches for next year's European Championship. This afternoon, Northern Ireland drew 0-0 in their Group 3 match against Moldova, but tonight Wales lost their Group 1 game against Switzerland in Zurich 2-0. At the moment, Scotland are losing 2-0 against the Czech Republic in their Group 9 game at Celtic Park. But now back to the main news, the escalation of NATO's airstrikes on military targets in Yugoslavia. NATO's made no secret of the fact that the air offensive has fallen behind schedule and has so far failed to halt Serb forces in Kosovo itself. A week ago, NATO's leaders said their war aim was to bring President Milosevic back to the peace table. But now many question whether that outcome is realistic or even desirable. David Schuckman reports.
The cruise missiles that opened the NATO campaign last week flew off to their targets with great precision, we were told. Not so precise is how this operation will come to an end. Just before the campaign started, the plan seemed fairly straightforward. The NATO Secretary-General told me 10 days ago how it would save lives by getting Slobodan Milosevic to the peace table. Now that's all changed, and Mr. Milosevic is seen as beyond negotiation. NATO's aims haven't changed, officially at least, to end the Serb repression of the Albanians, to get the Serb troops out of Kosovo, and to force Mr. Milosevic to sign the peace deal. But this last point now seems much less likely. Mr. Milosevic had been seen as the key to peace in Kosovo. He'd played that role in the Bosnia agreement at Dayton 4 years ago. But those who met him back then, like Britain's representative, have suddenly changed their view of him. He has too much blood on his hands now.
It's very difficult to see one negotiating an agreement with him and then relying on him as a partner for its implementation. I do not think that he is any longer worthy or capable of being dealt with in that way. Therefore, I think one has to find other people in Belgrade.
But Mr. Milosevic looks very well entrenched for the moment, so if NATO doesn't trust him to stick to a peace deal, if that ever comes about, it may have to go in on the ground. In Washington today, there were prominent figures calling for the alliance to see this all the way through.
Once you start threatening the use of force, and your bluff is called and you use force, then we have to prevail. There's just no question about it, and the future of NATO, as well as the future of the people of Kosovo, is very much at stake.
From NATO headquarters tonight, the message is one of confidence and determination. But the alliance is now in uncharted territory in the Balkans. The original tidy plan drawn up here in these buildings is being changed forcibly by the horrific events in Kosovo itself. The outcome couldn't be less predictable. David Shookman, BBC News.
Newsnight is on BBC Two at 10:30, but that's the 9 o'clock news. Good night.
You know, I look...
And now the main news stories from Look North. Hello, good evening. 2 young sisters have been killed in a car crash along with a third teenager travelling with them. 17-year-old Alexa Oxby and her little sister Gemma, who was just 15, died when the car they were in careered off the road near Mexborough in South Yorkshire. 17-year-old Trevor Mannion also died. Gillian Baxter has this report.
The family of one of the teenagers who died, 17-year-old Trevor Mannion, laid flowers today at the site of the crash which claimed 3 young lives. He was one of 5 friends in the car when it lost control on the road from Mexborough to Wath-on-Dearn just before 9 o'clock last night.
They were all good chums all out